VR. The dream of transporting your body to distant lands can be yours today for only
$599 US.
2016 was supposed to be
$299.
the year of VR. But after a few days into 2017, we can see that never really happened. We've seen the Steam VR page plagued with over 1,000 My First Unity project minigames. We've tried the cumbersome, expensive headsets with pixelated displays. We've seen the controversy over hardware-exclusive PC games, Oculus fumbling its pre-orders, the delayed Vive launch, and the disappearance of VR's poster child himself. It's left a lot of onlookers feeling iffy about VR's impact in 2016. But despite all this, the people that have bought into it seem to still really love VR. The people that haven't tried it are yet to be convinced of VR's feasibility, especially considering one must shell out so much money for a new platform without the Skyrims and the GTAs. Nearing the calendar flip of December to January 2016, when the Rift pre-orders were set to go live, enthusiasts were told the consumer Rift would be in the ballpark of $350, which seemed reasonable given the DK2 was $350, and the Rift and DK2 are fundamentally similar. January 6th rolls around and in the hopes of not sounding like too much of a shill, VR is something you need to experience for yourself to understand why people even care about it in the first place, let alone why they're paying so much for it. The thought of slapping a phone to your face and walking around your living room swinging giant Wiimotes doesn't really strike a positive chord with a lot of gamers right now. Tell them it costs $800 and its library is comprised of early access games, and they're quick to throw around terms like gimmick and sounds about as useful as a PS4. And they're not wrong to assume that. But the VR of 2016 is more than just a new way to view games, it's an entirely new way to interact with them. VR developers are in a tricky position of trying to circumvent the incompatibility of VR hardware in traditional 2D games. Games that would be awful on a monitor are suddenly masterpieces in VR, but they need entirely new control methods, game systems, and camera systems that haven't ever been done before. And these developers need to figure all of this out while making almost no money along the way. 2015 saw the Oculus buyout from social media giant Facebook. Through this buyout, they promised funding for new and existing studios that were interested in making VR games, which meant that the launch lineup for the Rift showed titles with enough juice that they seemed like they just came straight out of an E3 hype reel, which is actually a good thing, as developers got to go nuts with trying out new ideas on a brand new platform. The issue was that Facebook didn't seem to have any problems stepping on anyone else's toes while acquiring several studios, even after we were promised this would never happen. Some previously developed Vive games like the Giant Cops and the Arizona Sunshines were suddenly bought out by Facebook, which gave the developers a chance to polish up their titles, but required the developers to release their games on the Oculus storefront. Some games remained exclusive on their store for 6 months, and some were released on the store to remain exclusive indefinitely, which wouldn't be that big of a problem, except that the Oculus Store remains hardware locked to Oculus products, similar to what you'd find with the Apple Store. To get around the walled garden, Revive was developed, a tool that allowed HTC Vive users access to Oculus games. And everything was all dandy in the VR family, until a patch was released by Oculus that blocked Revive. So, naturally, people were pretty pissed. But not because they couldn't play the games, but rather they were upset because it cast a light on the direction Oculus and Facebook wanted to take VR. They didn't seem to care so much about whether you bought the game on a Rift or a Vive. What they cared about was locking users into their VR ecosystem. They wanted people to buy a Rift on brand recognition. They wanted those users to build up a library of content that they've funded and published and curated themselves. When the time comes for Oculus and Facebook to show off a new headset, and this is especially true when we see future headsets from other companies that promise better specs, comfort, and tracking. They want those in the Oculus ecosystem to look at their current library, to look at all the money they've spent buying these games, and realize they can't play those games with a competitor's headset, enticing them to buy the next Oculus product. This is what I call a purchase loop, where the promise of future software sells the current hardware, and the previous software sells the future hardware. Oculus reversed their Revive patch nearly overnight after facing the backlash, but I think that move will still be remembered well into 2017. Valve's approach at keeping people on Steam to buy their VR games seems more altruistic. For starters, Steam VR is labeled as an open API, allowing developers access to VR hardware from multiple vendors. Steam VR also doesn't require Steam to function. This also includes Valve-provided support for the Vive, Rift and its controllers, and most recently, Razer's truly open-source headset. Valve is also providing prospective VR developers with a financial cushion where they absorb the risk new developers are taking releasing a game for VR. They do this with what is essentially prepaid Steam revenue. They provide this to developers without any strings attached. If the game bombs, it bombs and Valve eats the loss. If the game is a success, they can move on and develop for other platforms. We've already seen this with Space Pirate Trainer, Job Simulator, and Fantastic Contraption. Valve hopes that this means developers are less likely to take deals that require them to be exclusive. With moves like these, Valve seems like they care more about the success of VR as a whole, and are less worried about who buys the most games on which storefront. This is also apparent when noticing Valve has provided their renderer, used in the lab, for free, for any developers using Unity to build their VR projects. Two different approaches to content development will naturally produce two entirely different content libraries. Oculus-funded games typically have the most juice and polish, but the crazy, weird, experimental games seem to be on Steam VR. In the short time the Vive has been around, we've gone from almost every FPS on the market being a wave shooter to tactical military shooters with full locomotion, as well as old games ported to VR with mostly satisfactory results. In April, developers seemed weary on designing games that didn't have you assume the role of a stationary turret. But just recently, we've seen a collection of games that break the mold, and work too. Hover Junkers, Onward, Doom 3 VR, Serious Sam VR, these all happened in less than a year on a brand new platform with a user base of less than 250,000. And to me, that's encouraging when looking at the future of VR games. But these games are still released in early access. Not in like DayZ early access, but more like what early access was always meant to be. Typically, developers on Steam release a VR game in an early preview state, but make large content updates as time goes on. Space Pirate Trainer has been spiced up so much the game now needs to be called Spice Pirate Trader. Vanishing Realms went from awful and broken combat to engaging, tactful swordplay nearly overnight. Raw Data has added multiple levels, new playable classes, and story elements, and a VR port of an existing pool game became the absolute best place to hang out in a virtual bar with strangers, play air hockey, skee-ball, darts, chess, checkers, and of course pool. Rec Room provides an incredible social experience with multiple game modes as well, and it's free. To that note, I've noticed most compelling software that shows the promise of what the technology can do is free. But that's kind of where VR is right now, just a glimpse into what the future of the platform will be. I think that's the main turnoff for people who haven't bought into it, is that the content doesn't look all that impressive when you're just watching Giant Bomb streams. I love watching people try VR for the first time. I always throw them into the Budget Cuts demo near the end, and every time without fail, someone whacks their head on the floor during a certain scene.
I can't put my head through the floor here.
Even though they know they're in my living room, crawling around on the floor like a blindfolded Nintendo toddler, they still believe they're inside of a video game. But as impressive as whacking your own face on your floor while blindfolded is, the PC side of VR suffers from an unnecessarily slow trickle of quality content, especially when you peep over the fence to see what your neighbor Sony is doing. It doesn't only suffer from the problem of how much content is available, but also how many installed users are available to sustain the longevity of that content. Even though we have different funding approaches by Valve, HTC, and Oculus, neither one of them are providing enough funding to allow the development of new, lengthy, in-depth single-player VR games. Some of the VR single-player games we do have come with a staggering 4 hours of playtime, with most others failing to reach even half of that. The developers that are lucky enough to gain additional funding use those funds for co-op modes or wave defense modes to pad out playtimes. So knowing this, developers are flocking to multiplayer games, which actually hurts the content trickle instead of improving it. The install base for PC VR headsets has been so low, the player base in something like Hover Junkers dried up the moment Battle Dome released. As soon as Onward entered the picture, Battle Dome became a ghost town. People are much less likely to buy multiplayer games, let alone a headset, if they know the player base will be dead after the first day of launch. With PlayStation VR, we have Sony funding games with juice levels that rival their own standard 2D games, and I think that's a greater sell to casual onlookers than all the early access Onwards and raw datas that PC VR offers. Sure, the tracking isn't as impressive as the the Vive, but the content that's already available, and Sony having such a large potential user base, this should give VR the necessary boost to increase public perception and continue to help build the install base to make single-player games more viable and multiplayer games more sensible. But this all comes down to price. With Valve playing the long con of letting indies and literally who studios run wild with the technology until they release their own games, and Oculus keeping their kits at a high price, It'll be a while before PC VR reaches the necessary strides console VR seems to have achieved with their multiplayer game longevity. There's still a long way to go, however. With Microsoft's upcoming Xbox Scorpio rumored to be supporting VR, and Microsoft also releasing a family of VR headsets made by established companies ranging from $200 to $400, we should hopefully see an upward trend of users that strengthen the entire VR ecosystem. The illusion of being inside a virtual world is a fragile one, and today's VR isn't quite good enough to make you forget that you're in your living room 100% of the time, but it's still good enough to always have fun with, even if your playtimes are short. 2016 might not have been the year of VR we all hoped for, and I'm yet to be confident that 2017 will be either. But I'm more confident now in the decisions being made by Valve and Sony to help keep VR in the spotlight, while more and more people slowly buy into it. 2016 was an expensive year, and 2017 looks to provide a refinement on some of the rushed decisions that were made previously. With so many ideas that are being thrown at the wall, whether it's game design or controller design, it's exciting to see what will stick in 2017. If there is one thing that needs to unstick itself, it's price. Hopefully 2017 will give us the options we need to bring that nasty number of
$599
to something more like
$299.
Oh, yeah, also this is not okay.